This lesson is employing the Web Workers API in JavaScript. The objectives for this lesson are to understand how to utilize the Web Worker API for effective background processing. We're going to explore various methods for creating a worker object. We'll learn how to send messages from the main thread to the web worker. We'll discover how to transmit messages from the web worker back to the main thread. And we're going to familiarize yourselves with error handling in web workers. Web workers in JavaScript are a way for web pages to run scripts on a background thread asynchronously, so very similar to promises. Now, the communication between the worker and the page is done via messages. Be aware that workers cannot modify the DOM. They can't access all properties and methods of the window object, but they can use a good many of them. And they run in what's called a dedicated global scope, not the normal global scope. What do I mean by that? Well, in an HTML page, you have the global scope for all your variables, functions, and everything in normal JavaScript. But in a JavaScript file that is a web worker, it's a dedicated global scope. So the two are basically in separate areas of memory. That's why we have to do what's called passing messages between one and the other, because you can't affect one scope from the other. In order to use web workers, they must be running in the context of a web server. So they cannot run on the file system. When I was doing promises in the last lesson and most of the other samples that I do, I'm running them on the simple file system. Web workers must run in the context of a web server. So that means you need to create a website. Now I'm going to use Light Server for the samples in this lesson. Light Server is a simple little server that runs on top of Node.js. A best practice is to always check window.worker to ensure that your browser supports web workers. Most of the modern browsers do, but it's still a good practice to do this. So we use the worker constructor to create a new worker object. You simply pass in the name of a JavaScript file that holds the code for the web worker. In that JavaScript file, we use the self keyword to reference the worker object. And there are two event handlers that we're going to be using. OnMessage, which is used to receive a message, and OnError, which is what we use to handle errors. The E argument being passed into the OnMessage event is a message event object. And we're going to see how we're going to interact with that message event object here. Let's create a web worker object in JavaScript. In this editor, you can see I've got a lot more files. That's because this is a Node.js project that is using Light Server. So if we were to look at the package.json here, you can see the dependency has Light Server, and that's what we're going to be starting. In the readme.txt, I actually have a little thing on how to run this sample. When you download this, you want to make sure you do an npm install and then an npm start to start the server running. Our first sample we're going to look at here is called worker create. And inside of here, inside of the script, I'm going to set let worker equal to null. I'm then going to use an if to check window.worker. I want to make sure that the browser does support web workers. I'm then going to create a new instance of a worker object by passing in the name of a script to the worker constructor object. This creates that new worker, and then I'll just do a console.log on that worker so you can see what's in there. Let's take a look at this script file called worker-create.js. So inside of here, as I mentioned in the slides, we're going to use self to reference that web worker, and I'm going to now connect up to the OnMessage event. That event will be passed a message event object. Let's go ahead and run this. So I'll go to my terminal window. I'll type in npm start. This starts up my browser. Light Server is what's doing this, starting up the browser. I can go over here to create worker object. And now we can see that I did indeed create a worker object. So right now there's not a lot of interest in here, so I'm not going to go through this. We're going to see more examples of this coming up in just a minute. Now that we have the worker created, let's pass a message from our main thread, our page, to that web worker in that JavaScript file. We send messages to the worker using post message. So on that worker variable I created, we're going to call post message, and I'm going to pass anything I want. This can be a string, a number, it can be an object, literal. In the JavaScript file, the onMessage event handler receives this message, and that message event object E then has a few properties that we can use. The main one being the data property. That's the one that contains the message. And again, that message in the data can be any valid JavaScript type, as long as that type is able to be serialized or deserialized. When passing things from one scope to another, that data has to be able to be serialized to go across that boundary. Let's take a look at passing a message from the main thread to the web worker. In this HTML file, I've got pretty much the same code, except where I'm creating the worker, I'm now passing in a different JavaScript file. So in this one, it's scripts/message-pass.js. And then you can see on line 33, I'm using worker.postMessage to pass a value from the main thread of execution in this web page over to this new scope where our web worker object has been created. So that's going to come in the E argument to this onMessage event. I'm then going to go ahead and do a console.log on E so you can see the various properties in there. Then I'm going to just go ahead and show you what is in E.data, and obviously that's going to be that string, Young Frankenstein. So let's go back to our browser. Here in our browser, this is our second sample here, pass message from main thread to web worker. If we open up our console window, we're now going to see our message event object. You can see all the various properties it has here, but the main one that we're looking at is data, and you can see it right here. You also see it down at the very bottom on the console window where I'm displaying that. Not only can we pass messages from the web page to the worker, we can also pass messages from the web worker to the main thread, and we do that by using the post message on that self object. So we're going to pass the message now from the web worker back to the page. So on the page, we need to set up the onMessage event handler on the worker object. And we'll again get a message event object passed to us on the page. Let's take a look at passing a message from the web worker to the main thread. Here in this HTML page, we come down here inside of our script, and here you can see we're again checking to make sure we have a support of web workers. The worker is now going to be using another script called message-get.js. And now notice I've got on lines 34 through 38, I'm responding to the onMessage event that I will get from the web worker. And then I can display the E.data. So whatever gets passed, I'm just going to be checking that E.data. And then I can also still post a message back over there as well. So if we take a look at the message-get, you can see here, I've got my onMessage, I'm receiving a message. I can do whatever I want to do with it. I'm not doing anything with it in this particular instance, but what I am doing is self.postMessage and then passing something back to the web page. Let's go back over to our browser. Let's now take a look at passing the message from the web worker to the main thread, and there you can see that I'm indeed getting that data back and putting it back onto the console window here. This is now happening on the web page. This is great. We now have the ability to pass things back and forth between the main thread, the main page, and our web worker. So what kind of work would we do in a web worker? Well, once you have the JavaScript file created for your worker, you can do whatever you want pretty much. You can call a web API to save data. You could call a web API to retrieve data. There are so many possibilities, just like what you could do inside of a promise as well, right? So all we're doing is kind of separating things out now. Instead of a promise, we're using a web worker. All up to you on which way you want to go. Let's take a look at just a very simple little contrived example of how to perform some work in a web worker. So an example might be if you have a form and you're gathering movie ID, a movie name, genres, actors, etc., and then you have a button that says save. Instead of performing the save right here on the one thread of execution, what we can do is move this off to a web worker. So in this case, we're going to create a web worker from this movie-save.js. And then what's going to happen is we'll pass data back to say whether or not something succeeded or failed, for instance. In this case, all I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to this movie save. I'm going to say, let's go ahead and call a function to save the movie data. So in the self.onMessage, I'm going to take the e.data and I'm going to pass it to the save movie information function here. And this is where you might do a call to a web API to save the data. And then maybe that web API returns to you the new movie that got inserted. And let's say it had a new film ID that was assigned and that film ID was 654, for example. So what we would do is we would now return that movie data from this function. Once we get it back on line 9, we're going to take that and we're going to now do a self.postMessage and pass that movie object back over to the HTML page where we will then do a worker.onMessage. We'll get that value back. That's a movie object. So inside of e.data, I'm going to go ahead and grab the film ID and I'm going to put that back into the input field film ID right here. You see at the beginning, it's a -1. When we call this save, it's going to go out, call the web API, get a new value, and that's what we're then going to fill in. And that way we know that, yes, indeed, everything was successful. So back over here in the browser, let's perform work in the web worker. Here we're going to have the -1, but when I click on the save, we made that call to the web worker. It did some work. And then it returned back to us the new film ID, so we know that this did indeed get added to whatever data store we happen to be using. Let's talk about error handling with web workers. In the web worker script file, you cannot affect the DOM. So if an error occurs in that web worker, the best thing is to simply throw an error. Then you connect the worker.onError event handler in your page. And then within the page, you can simply read that error and modify the DOM to report the error back to your user. Let's take a look at throwing an error from the web worker in JavaScript. In this HTML page, if we scroll down here, you can see I'm creating my web worker by using this script /worker-error.js. I then have worker.onError, so I'm going to handle any errors that come in this event handler. I'll get that error and I can use the error.message to retrieve any messages, and then I can use that to affect the inner text of that p tag. To trigger this error, I'm going to do a worker.postMessage passing in an empty string. If we take a look inside of our worker-error, you can see that what I'm looking at is if e.data equals a blank, we're going to throw an error from this web worker. Otherwise, I'll just throw whatever's in E out on the console window. But for this sample, all I'm going to do is throw a new error. This error is then going to come back over here, and it's going to come back in this error object that is the parameter coming into the onError event handler. So let's take a look at this one. Let's jump over to the browser. And we're going to click on this throw error from web worker. So here you can see that what I've got now is I've got an uncaught error from web worker. Remember, that was the message that I threw back. So it is indeed getting caught. I'm then just simply putting it on the console window, but I'm also putting it right here into that p tag. So you can see that in the p tag, that bold one, uncaught error from the web worker. So I'm affecting the DOM in the web page because I'm unable to do that in that web worker script. You are able to set up error handling within your web worker as well. So we can handle these errors in the worker script by connecting to the self-onError event. So if you had an unhandled error within any of the code inside of your script file, your web worker script file, then this event is going to be called. Now you could still throw an error from there if you want. But this is a way to basically handle any unhandled errors in your web worker script. So let's take a look at global error handling in the web worker script. In this HTML page, we're going to create a new worker from the scripts/worker-error-global.js. I've got a worker.onError here, that's fine, but it's not going to really do anything because what I'm doing now is I'm handling everything in the worker error global. I'm still going to post a message and pass in a blank string, so that part looks the same as what we just saw. So when we receive that message, if e.data is equal to an empty string, we're going to throw an error. But up at the top of this file, you can see that I'm now trying to handle any errors myself here in the web worker with the self.onError. I'm going to respond to this event. I'm going to get the error object passed to me. I'm going to go ahead and put a console.log in web worker on error so I can know that I'm there. Now this, I didn't do anything in the web page, but I might want to post back some message back to the web page so that I could make sure that we know that there was an error that occurred. And then this is really huge here. Make sure you return a true from this self.onError. Otherwise, the worker will be terminated. So if you don't do that, the whole worker is going to be terminated. And the next time you go to try to post a message or something, you'll get an unhandled error because the worker is no longer valid. So let's go over to our web page and let's go into the global error handling. Notice nothing is being displayed on the web page because I didn't respond to anything, but look down in the console window, you can see that yes, indeed, I did get into that web worker on error, and that's where I then displayed the uncaught error from the web worker. And again, then I could, maybe post another message that is of the type error, so it has a status of 500 maybe, and then you can do whatever you want to do on your web page. In this lesson, we gain knowledge on using the Web Worker API for efficient background processing. We investigated different techniques for instantiating a worker object. We acquired skills to send messages from the main thread to the web worker, and we uncovered the process of sending messages from the web worker back to the main thread or the web page. We also became acquainted with error management in web workers. In this module, we understood the distinction between synchronous and asynchronous processes. We acquired skills in using callbacks. We gained knowledge on working with promises. We learned to implement the async and await keywords. We discovered how to execute multiple promises simultaneously. And we familiarized ourselves with the use of web workers. So where do we go from here? Well, check out my From Zero to JavaScript Fetch API course that I have up there. Also coming soon are more From Zero to JavaScript modules, including templating, asynchronous programming, exception handling, array manipulation, set manipulation, data type methods, modules, DOM manipulation. So be sure to subscribe to my channel so you can keep up on all the latest modules I'm going to be releasing in this From Zero to JavaScript course.